When we are open to everything God has to say to us, in our consciences, in the stars, and in the text, we are being given the grace of wrong answers. It becomes possible to miss the mark and to see the red X by our answer and to bow our heads in gratitude. It becomes possible to learn prudence. Let's talk about socialism in the light of the Last Judgment. Some of the following was churned up in my mind through discussion with Joe Rigney last week, see below. As I've remarked before, quoting Woodhouse, some minds are like the soup in a bad restaurant, better left unstirred. Another thing that provided grist for the mill of my argument here, or as it may be, grist for my gist. Here is a clip of Stephen Wolfe arguing that while he doesn't want universal health care here in America, he doesn't see any problem with it in principle if some Scandinavian country wants to do it. By way of contrast, I see a huge problem with it in principle, and by that I mean biblical principle. The central biblical principle first. Let us begin by setting aside those issues where there would be universal agreement among faithful Christians, on issues like same-sex marriage or the child sacrifices of the abortionists. To differ with what Scripture teaches on such subjects would be to identify yourself as being unfaithful. These would be issues where people simply want to disobey what the Bible expressly teaches, like when the Israelites in Egypt tell Jeremiah they're not going to listen to him. But what about something like universal health care? The issue should not be whether or not there are circumstances when the government can perform this or that activity. Suppose we take the issue of tax-supported health care or a tax-supported day school. I can easily envision situations where such a thing considered in itself could be just fine. Suppose a municipal authority scooped up a homeless bum in order to put him on a bus to Portland in the morning. While in custody, he has a medical incident and is taken to the ER, and the city picks up the tab. That would be tax-supported health care, would it not? I, for one, would be okay with that. That kind of thing could happen in a liberty-loving society, sure. The problem has to do with size and extent. The Bible requires limited government. That is the principle. Suppose that a country decided, by democratic means, to tax all the citizens at a rate of 40% in order to support universal health care. The problem is not with a certain measure of tax money going to somebody's health care. The problem is the 40%. The sin is in the 40%. When Samuel was warning the people of Israel about their desire to have a king of the sort that the other nations had, what was he warning them about specifically? He was warning them about the kind of size that necessitated overreach. The Mosaic Law anticipated a king, Deuteronomy 17, which meant that having a king was lawful in itself. What was not lawful would be the sorts of things that kings like to do, the kind of things prohibited to him in Deuteronomy and warned about by Samuel. Here would be some of them. And he said, "This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields, and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants, and your maidservants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants." 1 Samuel 8:11-17. So Samuel warns about a bunch of taking. And what does Deuteronomy put off limits for a king? Also, a bunch of taking. "Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. Forasmuch as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold." Deuteronomy 17:15-17. A king may not multiply horses, women, or gold. A king, in short, may not multiply glory, gold, or girls. And the warning that Samuel gives the people contemplates the end of that whole sad affair. If you go along with this, you shall lose your liberty, becoming slaves. The word there is ebed, slave. Now, I don't believe that anyone would object if the White House hired 3 cooks and a confectioner, even though Samuel mentioned those occupations by name. But if the president were to build something 3 times the size of Versailles and all silver-plated, and there was a staff of 300 cooks working away in there, and the dessert cooks had made a 3-foot-tall statue of the First Lady made out of ice cream, we are clearly starting to get into Samuel territory. So where do we draw the line between okay and a disobedient, ostentatious display? Samuel draws it for us. He will take the 10th of your seed. He will take the 10th of your sheep. A king who is swollen to undue proportions is a king who claims as much as God does. God taxes his people with a tithe, and a king who thinks he needs as much as God does is a king who has quite forgotten himself. It is worth pointing out that we are so far gone that to get back to a 10% taxation rate strikes us as some kind of libertarian paradise. Thus, the public school system is manifestly unbiblical because of its size. A universal healthcare system is manifestly unbiblical because it is trying to become part of an environment in which we live and move and have our being. Quite apart from the falsehoods promulgated in secular schools, such schools are out of line for no other reason than their necessary usurpation. Universal healthcare would be out of line for the same reason. Quite apart from the quality of the healthcare, the extent of the healthcare indicates that we are dealing with bureaucrats who are already thinking about ascending the sides of the north. And once the river has overflowed the levee, there's no way for all of us to stay dry. The broader theological case. So Scripture requires limited civil government. God will not share his glory with another. Isaiah 48:11. Now, someone is going to object and say that I don't have a verse that prohibits a civil magistrate from taking over 10%, and by this I mean a verse that explicitly prohibits it. I would reply that I do. I just quoted them. But there's more. There's a theological foundation for all of this. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. John 2:24 and 25. So what is the central problem with the smart Johnnies, the social engineers, the grand idea guys, the schemers and ideologues, the aspiring Robespierres, the managerial elites, and the Ivy League graduates with 50-pound heads? They do not know what is in man. When Edmund Burke set himself against the French Revolution before the Terror, he was doing so as a quintessential Christian thinker. He knew what was in man. C.S. Lewis did the same when he argued that man was so fallen that no one was to be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Unlimited government among fallen men is not just prohibited by Deuteronomy or 1 Samuel. It is also prohibited by the theology of the entire Bible. That theology teaches us that man is fallen and susceptible to the blandishments of the devil. Power, like bad whiskey, goes straight to his head. This is why biblical theology requires us to acknowledge that the U.S. Constitution was a work of theological genius. In its system of federalism, checks and balances, and separation of powers, its underlying assumption was that we must never trust an American politician with too much power. This was nothing less than constitutional obedience. It was glorious. Too bad the heirs of those who drafted it have quite forgotten what it all means. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. James Madison, Federalist number 51. Yes, this is the great difficulty, but even many of the Christian heirs of the founders have forgotten this, and our chains will be forged out of that forgetfulness. Why Christian prudence needs to be actually prudent. When men say that the Bible doesn't address every detail of our modern political and cultural life, this is quite true in one sense. But too many people appeal to this obvious truth in a simplistic way, saying that some things must be left to Christian prudence. This is not wrong, but what many actually wind up doing with it is urging a form of Christian imprudence. Of course, some things must be left to Christian prudence, but to claim that your imprudence is prudent is imprudent. The sinful heart hates definition, hates to be pinned down. The sinful heart always wants to leave room for rationalization and evasion. Scholars and other smart people especially want to leave room for nuanced discussion, underneath which they can hide their sin and folly. But there's a difference between the nuance of the wise man and the subtlety of the serpent. The wise man can tell white from off-white, Hebrews 5:14. The subtle man justifies his off-white with appeals to white. This is why it is important to emphasize the centrality of Christian worldview thinking, all of Christ for all of life. Now, of course, because we are sinners, there will be men who will grab hold of what they call Christian worldview thinking in order to sanctify whatever their particular hobby horse is. Their temptation will be to overspecify. So we shouldn't do that. But the big-time temptation for most Christian political theorists is that of pretending that God has not spoken when he has spoken, and very plainly too. Although I prefer the term natural revelation, I'm certainly willing to refer to natural law. I'm Van Tillian, but I'm not a fastidious purist about it. That said, my two central objections to what some do with natural law are objections that leave room for responsible approaches to natural law. But my objections are these. When people argue that natural law would be binding whether or not there's a God, I find this incoherent. And I also object when people want to appeal to natural law instead of Scripture, when the subject in hand is clearly addressed by Scripture. I suspect that this happens because natural law leaves more maneuvering room, and men like that kind of maneuvering room. The issue of universal health care would be an example of this. While gazing at the night sky, it is easier to imagine a well-run Department of Health than it is when gazing at Samuel rebuking the Israelites. So is there a natural law case against it? I don't think so. Is there a scriptural case against it? Yes. Per hypothesis, universal health care requires the government to swell to a size prohibited to it. And as we reason within those constraints, we would urge people to remember that putting the DMV in charge of when your surgery gets scheduled is the very opposite of prudence. The last judgment will be granular. It will get down into the details. The judgment will encompass every idle word, Matthew 12:36. Jehovah will bring up cups of cold water, Matthew 10:42. The Almighty will inquire into the details of one's thought life, Hebrews 4:12. There will be no maneuvering room then, including with our political opinions, which means that we need to be a lot more wary of our desire for maneuvering room now. When we are open to everything God has to say to us, in our consciences, in the stars, and in the text, we are being given the grace of wrong answers. It becomes possible to miss the mark and to see the red X by our answer and to bow our heads in gratitude. It becomes possible to learn prudence.